A neatly folded envelope tucked into the mailbox, stamped with the cold, impersonal logo of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. The kind of letter that made your stomach sink the moment you saw it, because everyone in Silver Pines knew that HOA letters rarely brought good news. Inside, the message was clear and condescendingly polite. The HOA had conducted a routine compliance check and determined that the small flower garden in front of her house was a violation of community landscaping standards. More specifically, they cited it as unauthorized vegetation inconsistent with neighborhood uniformity. The penalty? A $5,000 fine. $5,000 for a flower bed. To be clear, this wasn't some wild, overgrown mess of weeds or invasive species. It was a carefully maintained arrangement of native perennials, lavender, echinacea, black-eyed Susans, all chosen for their low water usage and positive impact on pollinators. The homeowner, a quiet and persistent woman named Dana, had even installed a drip irrigation system to conserve water during the dry months. The garden was beautiful, colorful, and eco-friendly. But apparently, it didn't conform to the HOA's rigid idea of aesthetic unity: flat green lawns, 2 shrubs, 1 tree, and absolutely no personality. The absurdity of the fine was only made worse by the context. Dana had moved into Silver Pines 5 years ago with the idea that it was a peaceful, well-kept community. The kind of place where neighbors greeted each other, looked out for one another, and shared tips about lawn fertilizer and Halloween decorations. But over the past year, the HOA had grown increasingly aggressive. New board members had taken over, retirees with too much time on their hands and a hunger for control. They began cracking down on every minor infraction: mailboxes painted the wrong shade of brown, trash cans left out too long, garden gnomes labeled as unauthorized decor. Dana's flowers were just the latest target. At first, she tried to appeal the fine. She sent a letter with photos of the garden, included documentation from a local nursery explaining that all the plants were native and encouraged biodiversity. She offered to meet in person, discuss alternatives, even compromise on replanting a portion. But the HOA ignored all attempts at resolution. A month later, another letter arrived, this one colder and more threatening. The fine was now escalating due to non-compliance. Legal action was implied. They were serious. It was around this time Dana began to notice subtle changes in how neighbors interacted with her. Some still waved, but others avoided eye contact. A few seemed almost afraid, perhaps worried that associating with her might bring HOA scrutiny to their own lawns. She was being quietly isolated, branded as a troublemaker simply for planting flowers in her own front yard. But Dana wasn't the type to back down, not when she knew she was in the right. If the HOA wanted a fight over plants, they were going to get one, but not the kind they expected. She spent the next 2 weeks doing research. She pored over the HOA bylaws, hundreds of pages of legal jargon and outdated policies. She called city offices, zoning departments, and even a lawyer friend from college. What she discovered was surprising. While the HOA had authority over certain aesthetic elements of the neighborhood, there were glaring loopholes, especially when it came to the use of residential land for personal agricultural purposes. As it turned out, the bylaws banned unauthorized vegetation as a landscaping choice, but they didn't ban personal agricultural activity. In fact, under state law, homeowners were protected if they used their land for small-scale food production, provided it didn't involve commercial sales or livestock. The HOA couldn't fine her for growing food. They could fine her for flowers, but not for vegetables. And that's when Dana got her idea. If the HOA had a problem with her flower garden, maybe they'd prefer a fully operational suburban farm. Over the next few weeks, the garden came out. Lavender and coneflowers were replaced by rows of kale, cherry tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. A small trellis went up for beans. She converted half her backyard into raised beds and installed a compost bin. The front yard was transformed into a checkerboard of leafy greens and bright vegetables. She even painted a rustic wooden sign that read Silver Pines Urban Homestead. Completely legal. Entirely within her rights. And undeniably visible to every board member who drove by. Predictably, the HOA responded within days. This time, the letter was more aggressive. The board was deeply concerned about the unsightly transformation of her front yard and claimed that her activities violated the neighborhood's spirit of community consistency. But Dana was ready. She responded with her legal findings, documented her compliance with all local regulations, and included a note saying that she would be happy to discuss any constructive concerns during the next HOA meeting. The board didn't respond. But word spread quickly around the neighborhood. And not everyone was against her. Some neighbors, tired of HOA bullying themselves, came by to admire her work. A few even asked for gardening tips. One elderly man brought over a starter kit for heirloom carrots. Another couple helped her build a rainwater catchment system. Quietly, a small community began to grow around the farm, one rooted not in HOA approval, but in real neighborly support. But the HOA wasn't finished. Not even close. And what they did next would escalate the feud to a level Dana never imagined. The transformation of Dana's yard into a full-blown urban homestead sent shockwaves through Silver Pines. While many homeowners whispered their support, the HOA board was seething. Her defiance had become too public, too provocative. To them, she wasn't just violating guidelines, she was undermining their authority. Within a week of her last letter, new notices began appearing not just in Dana's mailbox, but posted publicly on the community bulletin board and emailed to every resident. The tone was urgent, inflammatory, and unmistakably targeted. The HOA's new initiative, labeled the Neighborhood Standards Enhancement Project, outlined a series of proposed rule changes. Among them, a prohibition against the use of front yards for any non-decorative cultivation, restrictions on visual clutter, and new guidelines requiring HOA approval for any landscaping change that significantly alters the original appearance of the property. It was thinly veiled policy warfare, rules written specifically to force Dana into compliance. To add insult to injury, the HOA scheduled an emergency community meeting to discuss the proposed changes. The notice emphasized that attendance was strongly encouraged, especially for those concerned about property values and neighborhood appearance. It didn't name Dana directly, but everyone knew what this was about. The move was bold, and Dana recognized the strategy instantly. The HOA wasn't going to play by existing rules anymore. They were going to change the rules. But she had anticipated this. In fact, she had already started preparing for it. Weeks before the meeting was announced, Dana began documenting everything. Every interaction. Every letter. Every plant. She kept copies of city ordinances and state protections for urban agriculture. She took high-resolution photos of her yard, from every angle, every week. Most importantly, she started talking to her neighbors, not just the ones who supported her, but the ones who were on the fence. She shared her story, her rationale, and most critically, the evidence that she was within her legal rights. As it turned out, the HOA had made one critical misstep. They had underestimated just how fed up the community had become. In their quest to micromanage aesthetics, the HOA had alienated more residents than they realized. One woman had received a warning about her porch chairs being visually inconsistent. Another man had been fined for having solar-powered lights along his walkway. A young couple had been reprimanded for having chalk art on their driveway after their kid's birthday party. Dana's story was just the spark underneath. Resentment had been building for months. As the emergency meeting approached, rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered about the flower lady and how she was standing up to the board. A few neighbors even began planting small vegetable beds of their own in solidarity. The HOA noticed this sudden trend and quickly labeled it a growing concern. Pun intended. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. More people showed up than the HOA expected. Folding chairs had to be brought in from the storage room. Some people stood against the walls, arms crossed, waiting for the fireworks to begin. The board members, visibly tense, sat at a long folding table up front, a row of bottled water and printed agendas laid out like a shield. What followed was less a meeting and more a community reckoning. The board opened with a rehearsed statement about preserving neighborhood standards, expressing concern about recent deviations that threatened the uniform charm of Silver Pines. They talked at length about property values and cited vague studies no one could verify. They proposed the new landscaping restrictions, suggested immediate implementation, and opened the floor for comments, expecting, perhaps, a few timid questions and then rubber stamp approval. But the crowd had other ideas. Resident after resident stood up, not to support the board, but to call them out. An older man told the room about the time he was fined for his American flag being too large. A mother spoke about how the HOA had sent her a warning letter because her kids left bikes on the lawn for an hour. People were angry, not just about Dana's treatment, but about years of overreach. Then Dana stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She calmly walked to the microphone, pulled out a folder, and began to read. First, she outlined the exact language from the state's urban agriculture protections. Then she detailed how every plant in her garden was legally compliant. She cited the HOA bylaws themselves, showing, page by page, how none of their current rules prohibited what she had done. She didn't speak emotionally. She presented facts, methodically, professionally, like she was in a courtroom. When she was done, she held up a copy of the latest HOA notice, the one proposing the rule changes, and said just one thing: this isn't about my garden. This is about control. The room erupted in applause. The board looked shaken. They attempted to regain control of the meeting, tried to downplay the issues, and promised to review concerns. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted. The community wasn't just reacting to Dana's situation anymore. They were realizing how much power the HOA had taken for granted. Over the next week, more vegetable gardens popped up around the neighborhood. Not all as elaborate as Dana's, but enough to make a statement. The HOA tried to issue warnings, but now residents were pushing back. Complaints began pouring in, not against Dana, but against the board. And the board? They weren't used to being questioned. Certainly not like this. Dana had expected resistance. What she didn't expect was retaliation. Subtle, at first. Then calculated. Personal. One morning, she woke up to find her compost bin tipped over, its contents scattered across her driveway. A few days later, someone reported her to animal control for illegally harboring livestock, a completely false accusation. Then came the anonymous complaint about suspicious activity at her home, leading to a police knock on her door in the middle of dinner. It was clear someone, maybe multiple someones, was trying to intimidate her into backing down. But Dana wasn't backing down. She was just getting started. By the time the anonymous complaints began, Dana had already crossed a threshold. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about standing her ground in a community that had allowed a small group of individuals to wield unchecked power over everyone else. If the HOA thought a few scare tactics would be enough to send her running, they had grossly misjudged her resolve. Still, the retaliation was unsettling. After the false police call and compost vandalism, Dana installed motion-activated cameras around her property, front yard, backyard, even discreet angles covering the driveway and side yard. She wasn't just being cautious, she was building a digital paper trail. Every incident would now be recorded, time-stamped, and stored both locally and in the cloud. She also began logging every HOA letter, notice, or email she received, noting patterns, language similarities, and suspicious timing. Something was off. The tone of the complaints, the way the board cited obscure violations no one had ever heard of before, it felt orchestrated. But Dana didn't spend all her time playing defense. Even under pressure, her homestead flourished. Tomatoes climbed taller than ever. Cucumbers hung in neat rows from her trellis. The kale was ready for a third harvest, and the peppers glowed in vibrant reds and oranges. What started as a symbolic act of defiance had become a highly productive mini-farm, and it didn't go unnoticed. Each weekend, more and more neighbors stopped by. Some came to ask questions. Others came bearing gifts, extra seedlings, and used mulch, even homemade jam. A few brought their kids, who were fascinated by the bees and butterflies that now danced between flowering herbs. One afternoon, a neighbor named Carmen, an elderly widow who'd lived in Silver Pines since its founding, brought over a binder. Inside were copies of old HOA newsletters, bylaws, and resident complaints dating back more than a decade. "This isn't the first time they've pulled this," Carmen had said. "They count on people not fighting back." Dana stayed up half the night reading through it all. Carmen was right. Time after time, the HOA had steamrolled residents with fines and veiled threats until they either complied or moved out. There were patterns, identical wording in letters from different years, always signed by the sitting president. Often no evidence, no hearings, no appeal process. This wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about precedent. Dana reached out to a local journalist who ran a small but well-followed blog covering suburban issues, HOA overreach, tenant abuse, city zoning fights. She sent the reporter a detailed email, attaching photos, videos, HOA letters, even excerpts from Carmen's binder. At first, the reporter didn't respond. But 2 days later, Dana got a message, "Let's talk." While she waited for the story to take shape, the HOA escalated again. This time, it was through a surprise inspection. A letter taped to Dana's door claimed that the HOA had received multiple complaints about rodents and insects originating from her property and demanded immediate access for an environmental inspection. A pest problem existed, of course. Her garden was clean, well-maintained, and even helped deter pests naturally. But the HOA wasn't trying to find a problem. They were trying to invent one. Dana declined the inspection. Legally, the HOA had no right to access her property without her consent or a court order. She sent a registered letter refusing the request, citing the lack of evidence and the potential for harassment. That's when the fines returned. This time, they weren't about the garden itself. They were for non-cooperation with HOA inspections, unapproved signage, referring to her Silver Pines urban homestead sign, and refusal to address pest concerns. Altogether, they totaled $3,750. It was a calculated move. The HOA wasn't trying to win the argument, they were trying to bury her in bureaucracy. But Dana had anticipated that too. She filed an official complaint with the state attorney general's office, attaching all her documentation. She also sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA via her lawyer friend, warning them that continued harassment would result in legal action. She CC'd the same local reporter, who, by now, had decided to make Dana's story his next headline piece. The timing couldn't have been better. Just a few days later, Dana woke up to an inbox full of messages. The blog post had gone live overnight. Headline: Petty Power, How One HOA Declared War on a Garden and Lost the Neighborhood. The story pulled no punches. It outlined the HOA's harassment, the community's growing unrest, and Dana's transformation from quiet homeowner to reluctant neighborhood activist. Screenshots of letters, photos of the homestead, and quotes from other residents made the article go viral fast. By noon, local news outlets were calling. By evening, the story had been picked up by regional TV. Within days, Dana had become the face of a much larger issue, one that reached far beyond Silver Pines. The effect on the HOA was immediate and devastating. Their inbox was flooded. Their voicemail filled with angry calls. State officials reached out with questions about their inspection practices. Even other HOAs began distancing themselves from Silver Pines, worried about guilt by association. But it wasn't over. Because the board still had one move left. A special meeting. No public input. Closed door. Rumors swirled that the board was preparing to vote Dana into forced compliance or initiate legal action to remove her from the neighborhood altogether. It was unprecedented. It was desperate. And it was exactly the kind of overreach Dana had been waiting to expose. The closed-door meeting was announced with just 3 days' notice. A bland, one-page flyer appeared in residents' mailboxes, stating the HOA board would be convening privately to review ongoing compliance issues affecting neighborhood cohesion and property value stability. It didn't mention Dana by name, but everyone knew exactly who the meeting was about. The wording was deliberate, vague, and deeply unsettling. Dana knew what was happening. She'd uncovered a clause in the HOA bylaws that allowed the board to propose a removal of membership privileges in rare cases of gross noncompliance or repeated disruption of community standards. It had never been used before, likely because of how extreme it was, but it gave the board the power to vote on stripping a resident of their privileges. If that passed, they could initiate court proceedings to force her to remove her garden, or worse, move out. But this time, Dana wasn't going to play catch-up. She was going to hit first. The morning of the meeting, she posted a copy of the HOA's emergency session notice online, along with a detailed public timeline of every complaint, fine, and letter she'd received. She included photos of her property, screenshots of messages from supportive neighbors, and highlighted sections of the bylaws and state laws she was allegedly violating, which, of course, she wasn't. Then she made one final move: she invited the press. By 4 p.m., 2 local reporters were parked just outside the Silver Pines Community Center. One had a cameraman with her. The other had a notepad and a serious expression. Neither was allowed inside the meeting, but their presence alone turned up the heat. Residents arriving for the meeting looked over their shoulders. HOA board members squirmed under the reporters' gaze. Inside the boardroom, the meeting was tense. Though it was supposed to be private, someone inside was secretly live texting Dana. A sympathetic neighbor. He described how the board president, a sharp-faced retiree named Lyle, opened with a speech about protecting neighborhood harmony and preventing individuals from undermining community expectations. He called Dana's farm an aggressive spectacle and accused her of encouraging nonconformity and lawlessness. Yes, lawlessness. Several board members nodded along, but others were visibly uncomfortable. Not everyone on the board agreed with this level of escalation. Some had joined years ago to help with landscaping budgets or pool maintenance, not to orchestrate a public witch hunt. Still, the vote was called. They proposed 3 measures: to fine Dana the full $5,000 retroactively for continued non-compliance, to strip her of HOA voting privileges for inciting division, to initiate legal proceedings for forced compliance or removal from the neighborhood, citing Clause 8. For B, but before the vote could be finalized, something unexpected happened. The door opened. A man in a suit walked in and quietly handed Lyle an envelope. Lyle opened it, frowned, and his face flushed red. The letter was from the state attorney general's office, responding to Dana's earlier complaint. The HOA was now officially under review for potential abuse of power, selective enforcement, and procedural violations. Any vote taken under investigation would be subject to reversal, and any fines levied without clear evidence would be considered null. The meeting imploded. Arguments broke out among board members. Some demanded to cancel the vote immediately. Others pushed to move forward, insisting it was their duty to act. But the damage was done. The press was outside. The Attorney General was watching. The residents were talking. And now, the board was turning on itself. Outside, Dana sat on a bench, watching neighbors file out, some of them shaking their heads, others giving her quiet nods of support. She hadn't needed to step foot in the meeting. The board had self-destructed trying to control her. That night, the live blog post about the meeting exploded in shares. The headline read, "HOA attempts secret vote to expel garden owner, state intervenes." Comments flooded in, most of them cheering Dana on. Other homeowners from around the country chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. The story was no longer local, it had become a symbol of resistance. But amid the celebration, Dana knew something else had happened that night, something subtle but important. The neighborhood had shifted. The fear was gone. Residents who had once stayed silent were now speaking out. Several had begun attending board meetings. Others were organizing a petition to recall the current HOA leadership. The power that the board once held in quiet, behind closed doors, had been dragged into the light, and it couldn't survive there. The next few weeks brought more changes. The state opened an inquiry into the HOA's conduct, especially around Dana's fines and the attempted vote. Several board members resigned quietly, citing health reasons or time conflicts. Lyle, the president, held on the longest, but after a damning investigative report aired on local TV, he stepped down under pressure. Dana didn't celebrate publicly. She kept working in her garden, now joined by volunteers from around the neighborhood. Kids helped water the plants. Retirees helped with pruning and composting. A local school even asked if they could bring students by for a field trip. The HOA still existed, but it had been defanged. And the garden? It was thriving. What began as a small bed of native flowers had become a fully functional suburban farm. The first harvest of fall squash was already underway. Basil and mint grew in bundles. Bees buzzed lazily between sunflowers and peppers. A chalkboard sign near the sidewalk listed what was ripe and available for free pickup. Dana had turned her home into something more than a place to live. It was now a quiet rebellion, a living symbol of what can grow when you refuse to back down. But the final chapter of this story wasn't in the garden. It was in what came next. By early October, Dana's front yard had become one of the most talked about pieces of land in the entire county. Not because of some scandal, or HOA drama, or a lawsuit, though all of those had played their part, but because of what it had become: a lush, functional, community-powered urban farm right in the middle of suburbia. The story had taken on a life of its own. Media outlets revisited it with follow-up stories titled things like "From Find to Farm," "The Woman Who Outgrew the HOA," and "Silver Pines," the neighborhood that fought back. What had started as a local fight between one homeowner and a power-tripping HOA had evolved into something much bigger: a quiet revolution. Residents from nearby neighborhoods began visiting. Not just to see the garden, but to ask how they could do it too. Some of them were facing their own HOA battles over mailbox paint colors, bird feeders, or solar panels, and they wanted more than advice. They wanted to fight back. Dana began compiling a resource guide, a PDF loaded with links to state ordinances, HOA loopholes, sample letters, and step-by-step instructions for starting legally protected urban farms in restrictive communities. She named it the Harvest Packet and made it free online. Within weeks, it had been downloaded thousands of times. But it didn't stop there. Inspired by the attention, a nonprofit reached out to Dana, an organization that promoted sustainable living and urban food resilience. They wanted to partner with her to pilot a program in suburban neighborhoods just like hers. The goal: show residents how to legally transform their yards into edible landscapes without breaking HOA rules. They called it the Harvest Movement. Dana wasn't a public speaker. She didn't want to be on stages or cameras. She was a gardener, not an activist. But she couldn't deny the power of what had happened. She agreed to speak at one local event, a small seminar hosted at the community library. She walked in nervous, clutching her notes and feeling wildly out of her depth. She walked out 90 minutes later to a standing ovation. Meanwhile, back in Silver Pines, real change was happening. The HOA board had all but crumbled. 3 of the 5 members had resigned. 1 had been quietly voted out in a special election. The final member, a soft-spoken woman who had voted against the motion to remove Dana, was now serving as interim president. She reached out to Dana personally, not with a warning, but an apology. For the first time, the board and the community were aligned. They wanted transparency, fairness, practical guidelines instead of power trips. And they wanted Dana's help to rewrite the rulebook. After some reflection, she agreed to serve on the temporary advisory committee. She wasn't interested in HOA politics, but if she could help prevent what happened to her from happening to anyone else, it was worth it. Over the next few months, the committee, made up of homeowners, not enforcers, redesigned the landscaping policies to encourage biodiversity, allow native plantings, and protect homeowners' rights to grow their own food. They added language that required clear evidence before any fines could be issued and implemented a public hearing process before penalties could be enforced. In short, they dismantled the old system and built something better. But Dana never lost sight of what mattered most to her: the farm. Every morning she was out there before the sun had fully risen, hands in the soil, checking moisture levels, snipping herbs, harvesting produce, and talking with neighbors who wandered by with coffee in hand. She kept the garden open, literally. There was no fence, no gate. Anyone could walk up, see what was growing, and take what they needed. Soon, a give-and-take produce box appeared by the sidewalk. Residents began dropping off extras: zucchini, lemons, even fresh eggs from backyard hens. It became a quiet, informal food exchange system in a neighborhood that, just a year earlier, fined people for stepping out of line. There was still the occasional grumble. One neighbor called the garden hippie nonsense. Another muttered about property values as they walked their poodle past the sunflowers. But for every critic, 10 others were thankful. And no one dared issue another fine. The real turning point came during the neighborhood's annual fall festival. Historically, it had been organized by the HOA, pumpkin-shaped banners, overpriced food trucks, a bouncy house, and polite conversations no one remembered the next day. But this year, the residents ran it. And they asked Dana to host it on her front lawn. She said yes, on one condition, that it be entirely free. And so, for one golden October Saturday, the front yard that had nearly sparked a legal war became the heart of the neighborhood. Kids painted pumpkins in the driveway. Neighbors grilled hot dogs and passed out herb bundles wrapped in twine. Dana gave small tours of the garden, pointing out native species and tips for soil health. At one point, a local news crew showed up, but by then, the story wasn't newsworthy anymore. It was just life. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over tomato vines and raised beds, Dana stood quietly at the edge of her porch, watching people laugh, talk, and gather under the lights strung across the bean trellis. She had fought. She had won. But most importantly, she had grown something that would last. What started with a $5,000 fine had turned into a movement, a new way of living, a neighborhood reborn. Still, there was one last thing left to do. And she knew it had to be done before the final frost. The final frost was still weeks away, but the air had already changed. Mornings came crisp and sharp, the dew on Dana's plants hanging a little longer, glistening like tiny icicles waiting for winter's call. Leaves turned brittle at the edges, and the garden, once bursting with life, was beginning its slow, inevitable fade into dormancy. But Dana wasn't sad. She knew the cycle. Growth always led to rest. Rest led to regrowth. That was nature's way. And the battle she'd fought, the one that had upended her quiet life and turned her front yard into a symbol, was over now. Not because her opponents had surrendered, but because they had simply lost the support to continue. The new HOA board, made up of community-elected members, had officially adopted the revised bylaws. Gone were the vague terms like unauthorized vegetation and visual uniformity. In their place stood clear, simple rules about respect, sustainability, and homeowner rights. More importantly, the spirit of fear was gone from Silver Pines. The residents had taken ownership of their community in a way they never had before. People walked slower now. They waved more. They stopped to talk instead of just nodding from behind sunglasses. Little gardens began popping up on streets Dana had never even driven down before. Tiny herb boxes. Strawberries in raised planters. A few chickens, even, approved through a new permit system the community developed together. It had all started with a flower bed. A quiet garden filled with lavender and echinacea. And a woman who refused to be bullied for planting beauty. Now, with winter approaching, Dana began preparing the garden for the cold. She mulched the beds, planted garlic, and sowed cover crops, crimson clover and winter rye. These weren't just about soil health. They were her way of saying, "I'm not going anywhere. And neither is this garden." She took down the wooden Silver Pines Urban Homestead sign, not because she was hiding it, but because it didn't need to be there anymore. Everyone knew what her home stood for. The sign would be repurposed into part of a cold frame to protect her lettuces through the winter. The final act came quietly, on a Sunday morning. She brewed a cup of tea, pulled on her boots, and stepped into the cool soil one last time before the first snow. Out front, she had cleared a small patch of ground next to her rosemary bush. There, in fresh soil, she planted a new tree. A dwarf apple. It was a gift from a neighbor, a thank you for helping them fight their own HOA dispute a few blocks over. Dana had hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted anything that permanent out front. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized permanence was the whole point. This wasn't about beating the HOA anymore. It was about planting something that would grow long after the fines, the board meetings, the news stories, and the anger had faded. It was about planting a legacy. The tree stood no more than 4 feet tall, a spindly little thing with bare branches and a fragile trunk. But she knew it would thrive. Because it had room. Because the soil was rich now. Because it had been fought for. Neighbors walked by that morning, offering smiles, nods, and warm greetings. A few stopped to admire the tree. One kid asked if it would grow green apples or red. Dana told him both, and his eyes lit up like she'd just performed magic. By noon, the wind picked up. Clouds rolled in. Dana stepped back, wiped the soil from her gloves, and looked at what her home had become. Not just a house. Not just a yard. But a landmark. A quiet place where control had been replaced by cultivation. Where threats gave way to community. Where the roots of change had dug deep enough to hold, even when the cold came. She didn't need banners or cameras anymore. The farm had spoken. And everyone, even the HOA, had listened. As snowflakes began to fall gently on the mulch beds, Dana smiled, stepped back inside, and closed the door behind her. The season had changed. But the story? The story was planted. And it would keep growing.